When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's finish this series with a weapon that's not really a weapon: the net. A net is a collection of threads or yarn twisted into a grid structure. Woven from grass or plant fibers, nets have been mainly used in hunting and fishing historically, but also find use in transportation, sports, furnishings, clothing, and even as a safety feature, such as the nets underneath circus performers. The net has been used by humanity since the Stone Age, with the oldest known nets used for fishing found near Antrea, Finland. In antiquity, all nets were made by hand, woven or looped together to fit their intended use. That use was, generally speaking, hunting and fishing, used to trap and entangle animals, which made it easier to harvest them as a food source. As weapons, however, nets are rarely seen on battlefields. In fact, one of the only historical examples of nets in combat are in the Roman gladiatorial games. In those games, a gladiator known as a rhetarius would be armed with a trident and a weighted casting net. This net would be used to entangle their foe, opening them up to attacks with the trident or dagger. But if that failed, the net would be abandoned. Fights with the rhetarius grew in popularity around the middle of the 1st century AD, and were a staple attraction in colosseums and gladiatorial games until they were banned in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. And that is really it. Of course, there may be other instances where the net was used by fishermen, sailors, or pirates as impromptu tools in combat, but the net itself is not a weapon. So if the net wasn't really a weapon in history, why does 5th edition consider it one? In D&D, the net is described as a tool adapted as a weapon to entangle opponents. Woven from rope, they were useful as hunting snares and traps, and were 3 times as effective at fishing compared to a fishing rod or spear. Present in the game since 2nd edition, the net of older editions cost between 5 and 20 gold pieces, weighed between 2.7 and 4.5 kilograms, and generally did no damage, used instead to entangle enemies. In 5th edition, the net costs 1 gold piece, weighs 1.4 kilograms, and deals no damage, but has a special property that restrains an enemy hit by the net. Much like the lance, the net is considered a special weapon in 5th edition. The majority of its effects are covered under the special property, stating that if a large or smaller creature is hit by the net, it is restrained until freed. This actually makes enemies quite vulnerable, as until a creature breaks free of the net, its speed becomes 0, attacks against it have advantage, its own attacks have disadvantage, and it has disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. There is inherent counterplay to the net though, as it's ineffective against huge or larger creatures. On top of that, the net can either be broken with a DC 10 strength check or damaged with slashing attacks. On the whole, the net is certainly a unique weapon option. While it can be used in certain situations to exert control onto the battlefield, it's not a direct damage weapon, which can go against the combat philosophy many players have of damage the enemy before the enemy damages you. On top of that, its extremely limited range of 5 feet normally and 15 feet at disadvantage means that characters who want to use the net are almost always throwing it at disadvantage. All of these factors come together to form a martial ranged weapon that can be helpful, but is often overlooked in favor of other weapons that can actually dish out damage. The net is one of those special weapons that feels like it was a good idea, but for some reason its implementation just didn't land. The idea of introducing weapons and equipment that allow martial characters to impose conditions on enemies is good, and something that can help bring martial classes more in line with spellcasters. However, its limited thrown range and cost of a full action to use really hinders its performance once you equip it. Rather than leave it as a bad martial ranged option, I'd like to go through some suggestions I had on how to fix the net in D&D. My first suggestion is to increase its range to at least 10 feet normally and 20 feet at disadvantage. The biggest downside to the net, as it is now, is that as a ranged weapon option, it's always thrown at disadvantage. Either you're throwing it within 5 feet of an enemy, which imposes disadvantage, or you're throwing it 10 to 15 feet away, which also imposes disadvantage. By upping the net's range to 10-20, or even 15-30, characters can use it without having to suffer disadvantage, making the net far more consistent and usable in combat encounters. By taking away its constant disadvantage, there is a valid concern that the net would then become too overpowered, as the restrained condition can be quite powerful. However, given the net's inherent limitations against huge or larger creatures, and the fact that it can be removed rather easily, I feel that the benefits gained from making the net more usable outweigh the costs. My second suggestion on how to fix the net is to add the finesse property to it. Ranged weapons normally use dexterity as their primary ability score, meaning that strength-based classes won't be as effective with ranged weapons. Adding finesse to the net would allow users to choose between using strength or dexterity with the weapon. This also has some precedent with the dart, a simple ranged weapon with the finesse property. This, in turn, gives strength characters a control option on the battlefield, allowing them to restrain a creature so long as their attack beats the enemy's armor class. My third and final suggestion on how to fix the net in D&D is to just remove it as a weapon option, and instead list it as adventuring equipment. Normally, I'm against removing weapons from the game in subsequent editions, but the net just doesn't make sense as a ranged weapon option. To me, a weapon is something that deals direct damage to an opponent, and while the net can be useful in certain combat encounters, that doesn't mean it should be put in the same category as longbows and heavy crossbows. By moving it over to equipment, it can also be freed from proficiency restraints, allowing more classes to use the net effectively. If that would make it too powerful, you could even require a tool proficiency to add your proficiency bonus to the net, which could be granted by the gladiator, sailor, and pirate backgrounds. All in all though, I just don't think the net should be a weapon option in D&D. Whether you personally believe it should be a weapon or not, Wizards seems to agree that it shouldn't be in the weapons table, as in the 2024 Player's Handbook, they've classified it as a piece of equipment, and increased its range to 15 feet. In my opinion, this is where the net really belongs. I've always viewed them more along the lines of ball bearings or caltrops rather than weapons, and as equipment, it can still provide a lot of utility to adventurers without being tied to as many combat and weapon mechanics. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the net and this series as a whole. Looking back on all the weapons of D&D, this whole series has been a learning experience for me, and I hope you've learned something too. I know I've learned a lot more about these weapons, their history, and their various implementations in D&D over the last 40+ years. And as the 2024 handbooks sit on the horizon, I'm excited to see how D&D's revisions impact the weapons and equipment we've covered here together. Thanks to some comments from all of you, my next step is going to be to compile all of these suggestions into a spreadsheet to view them in totality. And I may even make a video going over that sheet to reflect on the suggestions that I still think are good, and maybe some ones that didn't age too well. However, I can't really give an estimated time on when that's going to be released, as I'm up to my elbows in updating Alt-Roll's course materials for the 2024 revisions. If you'd like to join us over on the Discord to chat about the new releases, weapon masteries, or just keep in touch while I figure out what content I want to make, the link to the Discord is down in the description. I wouldn't have been able to get through this whole series without the support you all have shown me down in the comments. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. For now, that's all I had for you though. So make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll be seeing all of you next time.